So welcome everyone. My name is Eric Schmidt. I'm the Assistant Director for the African Studies Center. Our Director, Tim Longman, will be joining us shortly. He's just coming over from another meeting. We're thrilled to welcome Professor Marcus Walton as the newest faculty member in the African Studies community at BU, where he's an Assistant Professor of Political Science. Prior to joining BU, he earned his PhD in Political Science from Brown University and served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Public Affairs Research Institute in Johannesburg, South Africa, and as a lecturer at Wits University. Marcus also taught English as a Fulbrighter in Egypt before his PhD studies, and at Brown, his teaching was recognized with the P. Terrence Topman Award for Excellence. His research has been supported by the USAID Democracy Fellows and Grants Program and a National Science Foundation Fellowship supporting interdisciplinary methods in development research. He researches democracy and protest in North and Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically looking at how legacies of colonial and post-colonial rule define contentious politics in the 21st century, with particular attention to Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. We'll have a chance to hear from Marcus today and then have time for questions and discussion afterwards. You'll be able to use either the Q&A box to type a question, or you can raise your hand during the discussion and I'll be able to call on you and unmute you. And as I mentioned before, we are recording this lecture, so hopefully we can share this, for those who can't join us today. Can see it later. So please join me in welcoming Professor Marcus Walton.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for everyone for coming today. So today, I'm going to be sharing some research that originally came from my dissertation and is part of my existing book project. This is one part of it, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other research that I'm doing. So some of the research is part of the dissertation, as I said, but some of the arguments are a bit newer. I'm interested to get feedback and see what people think. The talk today is called Democracies, Preludes, Citizenship, and Contentious Politics in Egypt and South Africa. So in the past decade, citizens across Africa have repeatedly mobilized around some of the same grievances. This includes street protests and riots over access to basic goods and services. Examples include utilities such as electricity in Senegal, transportation in Mozambique, energy or fuel prices in Malawi and Nigeria, education in Kenya, food prices in Tunisia and Sudan. So according to the social movements literature, which is the best resource for understanding broad patterns comparatively about protests, strong democratic institutions should increase political stability, create new opportunities and demands and patterns of contention. So the forms of political mobilization that we would see looking comparatively across the region should differ based on regime type. Democracies should have certain forms of protest. Authoritarian regimes should allow and incentivize other forms of protest. So the question I asked today is, why might we see similar kinds of contentious politics across regime types? Now, in particular, I'm interested in contentious politics, but of course, political participation can take many forms. And what I talk about here is primarily protest, street protest. However, contentious politics could also be social movements, prolonged social movements, well-organized, prolonged social movements, boycotts, various different forms of political participation. But what I'm interested in here today is understanding the similarity in the forms of street protests, not just in the performance itself, but also the content of the protest, circling around basic or what you might call public goods. So starting in around 2011, which many scholars would attribute to the Arab Spring, we've seen a huge increase in protests across Africa. It's what many scholars have called the third wave of protests in Africa. The first wave being anti-colonial protests, the second wave being the protests against structural adjustment in the 1980s, also feeding into the democratic wave of the 1990s, and this current third wave. So as you can see, starting around around 2010, 2011, around the time of the Arab Spring, you see huge increases in protests. And this is according to Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. So several sources have really picked up on this and trying to identify some of the causes. For instance, the African Development Bank has said that new waves of protests are driven by economic conditions and poor public services. Analysis from the Social Conflict in Africa database has shown that food subsistence, education, are the third biggest issue shown in these protests, right after very broad conceptions of democracy and the economy. So in terms of concrete issues, public goods, basic goods were right up there as some of the most important issues in driving these wave of protests. Now, in terms of the scholarship that's covered this particular wave, many have attributed to the Arab Spring, the rise of a growing middle class in the region. This is in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Threats to democracy, whether multi-party elections, presidents trying to serve for third terms or something to that effect. Oftentimes, there's been attempts to include centrality of the economy or unemployment. As I said, material claims have been really important to understanding this wave of protests. Austerity and privatization, as I spoke before about structural adjustment or other forms of policies that have led to material hardship. Now, all of these are conditions that are adequate for understanding what you might call structural sources that are leading to protests, but none of them really tell us how this is happening. So what are the mechanisms through which people in the street are engaging with each other, mobilizing each other to come out and engage in protest? So in this sense, the demands and the symbols of collective action that I'm most interested in here are not necessarily ready-made. They have to be interpreted. They involve galvanizing masses of people. And how does it actually happen? So this is what my interest is in studying this third wave of protests within Africa. So if you look on the right, this is a map of the protests based on the data from Social Conflict Africa database. So today, across regime types, in both democracies and non-democracies, citizens are engaging in similar forms of contentious protest at an unprecedented rate. And in terms of similar forms of contentious protest, what I mean is street protest, oftentimes violent, not necessarily, but highly contentious, often spontaneous protests taking place in regards to basic goods, public goods, basic economic issues, but oftentimes having a connection to larger political issues. But at least in earlier stages, oftentimes mobilization around basic economic issues. So this includes democracies such as South Africa and Tunisia, which you might call hybrid or semi-democracies, such as Nigeria and Kenya, and authoritarian regimes such as Egypt and Sudan. So some of the answers we might find currently within the social movements literature might point towards and changes within structural conditions that would incentivize action. This is what many scholars have called the political process or political opportunity theory. So for instance, upcoming elections or fractures within the ruling regime or ruling coalition might be an example of certain changes that might actually incentivize certain actors to engage in protest where they otherwise might not. One of the problems with this, though, is that structural conditions or changes in those conditions can be interpreted quite differently. This is both within countries, but especially between countries. So it's not entirely clear how this might work. Even if there are structural conditions going on, for instance, a protest in one country, how is that actually transmitted to another one, assuming there is some kind of diffusion in that process? So another school of thought that's really interesting and important for thinking through this problem is what's called the collective action frames theory, which was developed by Snow and Benford, more recently by Erica Simmons. Or work by Erica Simmons borrows on this concept. So the argument here being that collective action frames are essentially discursive patterns used to interpret, galvanize protesters, give meaning to collective action, provide an identity for protesters. So examples of this that are well known will be the use of the term "we are the 99% during the Occupy movement. So what I say today is that frames are themselves certainly an important way of understanding how certain claims have been interpreted and used to bring together people for protest. However, it's not clear exactly how that moves beyond just the content of the protest into the form itself and what exactly those frames are that are being utilized. Another concept that is key here in thinking about why you might see not just one form of protest occurring at one point in time, but similar protests in repeated instances. For instance, let's say you see protests around a fuel subsidy in Nigeria, and Nigeria has a very particular history of this occurring repeatedly over a course of decades. This points to the idea of repertoires, which is also used in the social movements literature. Now, repertoires, defined quite broadly, are the means by which people engage in contentious collective action. And I'll give an example in a second. But others define it as specific actions such as riots, demonstrations, strikes, sit-ins, petitioning or lobbying carried out by collective actors over a specific a period of time. So for instance, on the top, you see a picture of a peaceful protest in a corner. On the bottom, you see a protest of what looks more like urban street riots. These are different forms of repertoires in which actors are engaging in contentious action and protest. And the argument being that oftentimes you'll see repeated patterns over time in certain contexts where certain repertoires are being used, not just necessarily in the way that people are protesting, but the claims that are being mobilized. So on the one hand, as I said, there's a performance aspect to repertoires. What are people actually doing? What are the rituals that are being performed? Is it violent or non-violent, organized or non-organized? These are some of the questions that are important for understanding repertoires and patterns of protest over time. At the same time, many social movement scholars have made a distinction in the claims that are being mobilized within these repertoires. So are the claims very specific, what they might call parochial, or are they more cosmopolitan, more broader political issues? And there's a particular history that's been mapped out by social movement scholars in understanding these changes and how repertoires might differ over time. So a very famous repertoire, for instance, that people might know is the use of the barricades in France, which has had a long history stemming from the French Revolution, using the Paris Communes, but still used today within France as a form of protest and mass mobilization, a tactic that's used by protesters in France. So getting back to the social movements literature, scholars often identify what's called the old repertoires, or more classical forms of contentious mobilization, which often identify what I talked about before as quote unquote parochial claims. So things like, for instance, this quote from Sidney Tarrow: demanding bread, asserting belief, claiming land, and mobilizing around death were all four areas of contention, collective action, which were violent, direct, brief, specific, and parochial. So in this sense, these forms of protests, again, violent, parochial, what they describe as peasant mobilizations, were considered traditional old repertoires, the ways that the contentious action used to take place prior to the 18th century. Obviously, this is very Western-centric history in the way they're understanding these concepts, and that's partially what I'm arguing against in this paper. So according to this theory, around the 18th century, more modern repertoires started to emerge, with higher forms of organization, more flexible claims, broader political grievances. This will culminate in something like what we think of today as a very organized, sustained social movement, as opposed to a spontaneous, brief, violent street riot, for instance. So according to Charles Tilley, who's one of the leading scholars in this concept, to understand how repertoires change over time, he argues that repertoires move away from parochial claims and violent street performances towards well-organized, sustained social movements, according to changes within the regime type and state capacity. So as you see increased state capacity and particularly democratization, you should see a change within the performances themselves. So repertoires will change as regime type changes. This is what I talked about before earlier. The idea that stronger democratic institutions might incentivize, for instance, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and provide all of these rights that would incentivize certain forms of collective action and contentious politics over others. So why does regime type matter to protest claims or performances in this instance? Well, to summarize the basis of this particular theory, why protests might change between regimes, the authors often cite the concept of citizenship. So by citizenship, what we might mean here, in the traditional sense, is the rights and obligations that are binding government and the people. So according to these scholars, citizenship only forms above some threshold of capacity and democracy. In this sense, a transition to democracy opens up what we would call citizenship, completely changing the incentives for people to mobilize, the kind of rights they may have vis-a-vis the government in terms of protest, and is a very key factor in understanding different patterns of repertoires or protests over time. Right. So the rights of citizenship here, according to this theory, create and protect certain claims and forms of contentious action. Of course, none of these theories preclude the possibility that you could have a spontaneous violent protests in a democracy. That's obviously true, or sustained peaceful mobilization in non-democracies. Nonetheless, across the literature, there is a general implication that the form and content of political participation is largely driven by the quality and extent of citizenship rights. And to some extent, this is intuitive for the reasons we've listed. But one of the problems with this particular assumption is that it itself assumes that an even process of social and political transformation, in this instance, democratization. So one could argue that it's possible to have different experiences of the state or of democracy, whether both under authoritarian regimes or in a democracy. So you may have different experiences with the state under authoritarian regime or different experiences with the state under a democracy. This is a theory that's been pursued quite heavily for those familiar with the subaltern school, Ranajit Guha's work, peasant revolts in India, more recently Partha Chatterjee's work, thinking about the distinction between civil society and political society within democratic India. Other works that have clearly pushed against this idea, that are more well-known, have cited the processes of social change can often happen unevenly. So we talked about democratization, but a more classic example that people might be familiar with would be E.P. Thompson's work in thinking about class formation in England. Now, Thompson is well known for his argument about the moral economy, but what people often overlook is that his main argument here was to say that traditions that might be seen as pre-modern, quote unquote, was still an important part of working class politics, which is to say that you don't wake up one day and suddenly you're part of the proletariat, that there's a long process that the working class was present in, present meaning they were both resistant in and they were part of that history. And that what we might think of as traditions that would be left behind as being pre-modern were an important part of working class history long into this period of class formation. Okay. So this goes to the idea of an uneven process of class formation, which I'm also expanding here to thinking about democratization. These ideas have also been used in thinking about colonial and post-colonial history. For instance, Frantz Fanon's work in The Wretched of the Earth, thinking about the legacy of the Manichaean city and the way the political and racial categories get fused together within the Manichaean city. Now that gets reproduced within the post-colonial nation state under the guise of nationalism. And this work was obviously quite influential for Mahmoud Mamdani, whose more famous work, Citizen and Subject, not necessarily more famous than Fanon, but quite famous work, Citizen and Subject, points to the way that different colonial experiences have led to different approaches to politics between both urban and rural areas in democratic South Africa. So again, we're seeing a pattern whereby certain experiences in the colonial period, or what the apartheid period in South Africa, led to different politics being formed within democratic South Africa. So in another sense, there's an uneven process of social change that's not necessarily uniform in a way that would make for clean theorizing and moving in a unilateral, a linear trajectory. So removing this assumption about democracy and citizenship, the idea that they move hand in hand, that democratization is one smooth process, and in one sense you're a citizen, you're a non-citizen before, and suddenly once democracy provides you certain rights, you're now a citizen with rights and obligations. Once we remove this assumption and start thinking about the uneven processes through which social and political change can take place, this allows us to think about at least two things. The first is the potential overlaps between democracies and non-democracies, meaning for some people living within democracies, their experiences might be quite similar to those living in non-democracies. This again goes to the work of the subaltern school, but also we might think of divergences within democracies. This is the work that I'm more interested in my book project, and looking at subaltern traditions of protest across Africa within existing democracies. So for instance, in issues around access to basic goods, where you might see very different conceptions of interactions with the democratic state and what democracy is supposed to mean within the same state. The second issue, and this is what I'm more concerned about today, is the way that conceptions of citizenship and rights might transcend what we might think of as a democracy, non-democracy distinction, which is to say that certain practices or histories that we might see of as being pre-democratic or claims makings that have their own history in that sense, might have lasting political legacies way into democracy. In this sense, it wouldn't be surprising to see claims making within democracies that might be quite similar to forms in non-democracies. So again, we're breaking down this divide by looking more seriously at these categories of citizenship and how colonial or pre-democratic histories would inform that. So to revisit the question, why might we see similar kinds of contentious politics, claims, and performances across regime types? So using the case of housing protests in democratic South Africa and bread protests in authoritarian Egypt, I argue that on the one hand, the grievances being mobilized across cases are similar because in each country, the protesters are drawing on rights-based material claims. So in other words, protesters are using what we might think of as seemingly economic claims to mediate for shared conceptions of national citizenship. So this might be less surprising within a democracy, but why would this actually work within a non-democracy if we think of citizenship as being formal rights and obligations? Well, as I argue, these performances or the spontaneous street protests are similar across regime types because these citizenship claims are based not on formal legal rights necessarily, but on histories of popular rights and mass revolt. So these histories are shared amongst current democracies and non-democracies alike, oftentimes through connections in historical phases of waves of protests in Africa, which I talked about earlier. For example, the wave of structural adjustment or austerity protests in the 1980s, which we'll talk about today. So in this case, you would get an instance in which countries that might have very different regime types today had similar experiences of mass revolt during a period of time. And the legacies of those particular periods are still pertinent, despite the fact that you might have seen regime change later on. So citizenship is still imbued or has these aspects of popular revolt embedded within it. So the two cases I'm interested in are bread protests in Egypt and housing protests in South Africa. So as I said, I chose these two cases as part of a larger project where I actually looked at three cases on Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. I could talk a bit about the Nigeria case where I look at fuel subsidy protests in the Q&A. But these two cases are being compared largely because they defy the literature in terms of what we might expect in terms of repertoires or performances around contentious politics. You would expect that within democratic South Africa, you might see very different practices of protest than what you might see in authoritarian Egypt. And yet you see quite a bit of similarity, as I will show. So in both cases, you have street level, often spontaneous protests and riots around basic goods. So to think about this more broadly, citizens in one of the most and least democratic countries in Africa in the 21st century, both are repeatedly engaging in what the literature calls some of the oldest forms of contentious politics, bread and land riots, basically. So how do we understand this? As I argue, these cases are largely representative of the general phenomenon of the protest wave that I talked about in Africa going on since 2011. And these are two of the most concentrated cases of protest during this wave. So we're not talking about just one particular event, although I cover one event specifically here in talking about Egypt. But for instance, bread protests have a very long sustained history within Egypt, for instance. And in South Africa, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller events over a longer period of time, stemming from the 2004 up until today. So this research was based on 10 months of qualitative interviews, participant observation. In some instances, direct observation of protests and demonstrations. So in Egypt, this is in February, November 2011, also in June 2013. And in South Africa, this was protests taking place in the Zandspruit township outside of Johannesburg in April 2016, and in Durban in July 2016. So in terms of what I'm doing here, I identify patterns across the spectrum of different participants. So this is not necessarily random sampling, although to an extent in South Africa, the participants were random. But what I'm looking for is a saturation of views. I'm trying to understand what are the general patterns across different populations through which people are understanding this specific event. So in Egypt, this included 48 respondents. Many were protest participants or activists, would identify as being in lower middle class across several governorates, Greater Cairo, Port Said, Minya, Ismailia. In Egypt, obviously random sampling is not possible. So this was mostly done through snowball sampling and trying to diversify my networks of respondents as much as possible. In South Africa, this involved 94 respondents, protest participants within different communities, townships and informal settlements, largely around Johannesburg to an extent, though in Pretoria and Durban. And these selections of respondents were random. So we randomly selected households within the township. So I will start now with the two cases. The first being 2000 Egyptian revolution. Now, I need to qualify this by saying that the Egyptian revolution on the whole did involve obviously very well organized protesters. However, there were aspects of it in which there was mobilization that was spontaneous, although deliberate amongst organizers in terms of galvanizing people around very basic claims, such as bread. So for those familiar, Hurriya, Adilat Ijtimaiya, bread, freedom, and social justice was the slogan of the Egyptian revolution. Now, bread here is also a pun which can mean life, and that's something that my respondents did play off of. However, when they're speaking about bread and its significance, it was used more seriously to mediate for broader political claims, as I'll show. So they're talking about bread specifically, but it's not just bread. Bread is being used as a way of better understanding some of the ways that people go through economic and social hardship and the ways that they have to try to make ends meet. So if we're speaking quite literally, subsidized bread is what you would consider entitlement for both lower and middle class Egyptians. It's extremely cheap. The lowest currency you could buy couldn't even get you like one loaf. You could get you about 5. So it's extremely subsidized historically for decades. It's been very contentious and difficult to remove subsidies. There's been attempts to try to change the system of distribution more recently, but there's a very long, extensive history to understanding the bread subsidy in Egypt. So as several scholars have argued, activists that were trying to mobilize protesters during the Egyptian revolution went out into Cairo and were using demands specifically around basic goods like bread, trying to bring people out. And I'll show an example of that later on. The reason why is because they believed these frames would resonate and would be viewed as a basic right. So thinking about this idea of connections and claims to bread as a right itself. This is not because of any constitutional right. There is no constitutional right to bread. But the way that these claims can be mobilized within popular history makes them akin to what you would call a popular right. So many people would associate the Arab Spring with claims to democracy, which is certainly true. However, it's also important to put those in context. Democracy is a very broad term. So when we say democracy, what do we actually mean? Well, if you look at the Arab Barometer survey, which took place right around the time of the Egyptian Revolution, 76% of Egyptians ranked the provision of basic necessities and reduction of inequality as the most important aspect of democracy. And this goes to the heart of what I'm trying to understand with this particular project. What does democracy actually mean? What does this citizenship mean? What are the kind of claims that get mobilized and are making the future of African democracy? And how do we understand the histories that inform this? There's different ways in which you could start in trying to understand the history of bread, which goes back really centuries. But one way for understanding really the right to bread and the way it's been politicized more recently is thinking about the populist president Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was president 54 to 1970. So this is a quote from Nasser, although it's indicative of many of the speeches that he would give. And he was a very charismatic leader, a great orator. There's many famous speeches that spoke to nationalism, dignity of the masses, and in particular are still relevant for understanding the kind of claims that are being mobilized in the revolution in 2011, as I'll show. So in this quote, under colonialism, the people were clamoring for freedom, and they know that freedom was one thing and bread was another. But what does freedom mean to a man who cannot earn his daily bread? After this revolution took place, each citizen believed in the fact that there is no liberty without bread. Now, again, Nasser is playing on this pun, this idea of bread being, on the one hand, the physical bread that you eat, but also life. However, he at the same time was instituting an extremely large bread subsidy program, which is the one that basically is still going on today. So Nasser was engaged in a lot of politics to try to import wheat from the Soviet Union, from the US, to try to support this bread program. So when he's speaking about bread, there is, again, that play on words, but he also means quite literally subsidized bread. One of the reasons he's speaking to this is under colonialism, or what was formerly independence, but really colonial occupation by the British. During the World War efforts, the British would take wheat from the countryside, and this would lead to famine and malnourishment, and became a major issue in the early 20th century in the rural areas of Egypt. So Nasser was aware of this, and he plays on this and talks about it in many of his speeches. So the idea of hunger is tied to colonial oppression, and in many ways, him as a post-colonial populist leader, providing bread was quite symbolic in that sense. As you can see on the left, there are several instances of Nasser's image being used, his legacy being invoked to an extent during the revolution. So as I said, Nasser justified popular claims to basic goods, not necessarily just bread, but though bread possibly being the most famous, through the language of dignity and nationalism. But in this sense, dignity was not just about avoiding hunger. It was also about not having to beg or ask for sustenance. So the idea that people might have to wait in line, for instance, for hours was considered an affront to their dignity. So basic entitlements like bread took on a kind of political and cultural valence over time and became what you would call a recognized claim, a viable claim that people can make on the state, even ordinary Egyptians can articulate, and solidifying as a kind of popular right over time. Now, looking at some of the activist message boards that were going on during the revolution, protesters and organizers were very well aware of these tropes and the histories of bread riots, stemming from, as we'll talk about in a second, in the 70s, but also more recently it happened in the 2000s, issues around the bread subsidy. And they deliberately were trying to use this particular frame as a way of galvanizing people and speaking to some of the material issues in addition to the political and social issues that were going on at the time. So according to one of the message boards, January 25th must be a day for the comments driving citizen who is unable to make a living, who stands 3 hours in line for bread. Again, playing on these types of tropes around dignity, around claims making, specifically related to bread. So it's important and actually impossible to talk about this topic, especially in thinking about mass protests, without citing the 1977 bread riots in Egypt. So this is a quote from Khaled Ali, who is a well-known labor activist, was also at one time a former presidential candidate. It is no coincidence that bread was the first word of the revolution's main slogan. The demand for bread or daily rationing has been central to the Egyptian people's economic and social demands since the 1977 bread uprising. Food security is the Egyptians' most basic right. Again, we're not talking about a constitutional right per se, but the consensus or the idea of a popular right is quite powerful within the political discourse. So in 1977, after Nasser had passed away, Sadat came to power in the 1970s. And Anwar Sadat, one of the policy plans that he introduces in Fatah plan was to open up or liberalize the economy. And part of this is one of the earliest forms of structural adjustment, the earliest form, I believe, in Africa, actually, 1977. And this was an event that is widely cited within the interviews I was doing for trying to understand the context as to why bread was an important part of the revolutionary slogan. So for people who are even too young to even experience this particular event, there was a constant reminder to me as the interviewer that I need to understand the context of 1977. So in 77, when Sadat liberalized the price on several basic items of food, this included flour, there were mass protests bringing together labor movements, students, civil servants, to try to overthrow or basically get them to repeal the reforms. This is one of the very few instances, at least in the late 20th century, of mass revolt in this sense that was really challenging for the government. So according to one of the people I interviewed, before we even started to try to understand the significance of bread, he said, you should know what happened in the 70s when El Sadat raised the price on food and there was like a start of a revolution. Now that's just one example. And there's the other example of Khaled Ali who noted that, but this was a constant reminder within the interviews that 1977 was an extremely important event that pointed not only to the importance of bread, but the idea of popular revolt and the defending of basic rights or popular rights to bread. So in this sense, 1977 served as a shared cultural reference, which gave some kind of historical context and meaning to the protests. This is not to say that people were thinking of 77 when they're going out and protesting in 2011, but that trying to understand the claims themselves and justifying those. Certainly the idea of bread as being something revolutionary and part of mass revolt does bring in or invoke the legacy of 1977. So if Nasser introduced the idea of a popular right through nationalism and dignity, Sadat's reforms in 1977 really solidified bread, amongst other things, as a right that could and would be defended through popular revolt. So not just the idea that there's a right that you can claim, but justifying the mobilization and mass revolt that went on in terms of contesting for this right. This was all part of understanding this history and this legacy of 77. So as I argue and as I discovered in speaking with the different interviewees, this was an easily accessible narrative, even for people that were far too young to obviously to even remember or participate in these protests, that connected basic goods with popular revolt in Egypt. And again, before 2011, it was one of the few really historical moments that had this type of valence with it in terms of recent popular revolt. So again, in thinking about how these ideas were coming together and how they're often articulated in explaining participation within the revolution, and particularly thinking about bread as a claim that was being mobilized at that point in time. As one interviewer told me, this, as he was literally holding a piece of bread, is our dignity. It's a right that they've stolen. We should get this no matter what, not wait in line for it. So again, there were many claims that were being mobilized during the 2011 revolution, but one of them in particular was bread. And that was both literal and figurative. Yet the literal sense has a very specific history that ties to a concept of mass revolt that is very well known within Egyptian society. So one of the basic primary claims used by these activists was claims to basic goods, especially related to popular rights such as bread. Now, this tapped into widely recognized histories of revolt that we talked about that related to bread riots and a call for mass street protests. In many ways, these particular framings, they galvanized participants in thinking about the quality of citizenship, the struggles around making ends meet, and these particular claims themselves mediated for broader political claims. So thinking about citizenship and bread is inseparable in many ways in this context. It's not just about the price of bread, but it's also about the concept of popular rights, which provides a framework to think about citizenship more broadly. The second case I look at is what's called service delivery protests in South Africa. Now, these are small community protests which began, depending on who you ask, but arguably around 2004. Often spontaneous protests occurring on what you would call the urban periphery and townships around major cities in South Africa, townships being satellite cities, traditionally where Black labor lived. So the triggers and demands often vary quite widely. These can be issues like corruption, local conflicts. However, housing is often used as one of the most commonly cited frames for these grievances. So this is from data that was collected over the first 10 years of the protest, really. And as you can see, housing is the clearest and most common issues that are being cited. However, in general, service delivery protests can also relate to issues related to housing. So if I don't have water piped into my house, if I'm not getting electricity or something to that effect. However, the quality of housing itself has been quite central in understanding these particular claims. So the program that's most popularly used in South Africa is a housing subsidy program where you would essentially apply to the government and you can wait up to, it can take several years, it can take decades at this point, and the government will inform you, depending on certain parameters, your age, income level, all these things, and you can be awarded a house. Oftentimes these houses are built far out from the city, and it makes it difficult to get access to work if you work in the city. However, these are houses that are basically being provided to people oftentimes for free. However, providing services to these neighborhoods has been quite difficult, and the quality of the housing has been a challenge. But moreover, what you've gotten is people living in informal settlements who have been waiting for a house for decades and still have not received it. So all these issues culminate within these protests where housing has been quite central. Now, why is it that housing is so central to these protests? So for those familiar with the history of South Africa, housing was quite central to the segregationist system of apartheid, which began in the 40s, ended in 1990. This can control basically where you could live. I mean, it was a totalitarian system of segregation that very much wanted to control people's movements, how they interacted with other people, separated them based on race. So housing was central to all of this. Due to that, housing became one of the central demands of the anti-apartheid movement. If they wanted to dismantle the segregationist system, demanding rights to housing was an important part of this. So this started in 1955, you could argue, with mobilization around the Freedom Charter, which is essentially a charterist movement trying to develop claims as part of the anti-apartheid movement for what people were looking for within a post-apartheid society. One of the most important claims being mobilized here was the idea of housing. And one of the claims used in bold in the charter is there shall be houses, security, and comfort. It's a phrase that's been used many times, especially in the 80s was used to justify forms of mobilization that we'll talk about. So top right here, you can see an example where the phrase is being cited in a poster that's being used to justify protests going on in the 80s. So in the 1980s, as the apartheid state was experiencing forms of austerity, increasing international boycotts, the local township areas were completely underfunded, and as a result decided to raise rates. They made most of their money through taxation, through local rent and utilities. So raising of rates was seen as a way to raise funds. However, what the residents of the township realize is that they actually boycott these rates and don't pay any rent. You can cripple the township and make it essentially ungovernable. They can't provide services because they can't collect payments for services, they can't collect payments for rents. So the local government essentially would fall apart. And this was what happened during the 1980s, and it brought the apartheid regime to its knees. So part of this mobilization was around a right to housing, not having to deal with these the ridiculous rates that were being charged for housing, for overcrowded townships, the living conditions in general within the townships that were just unsustainable. So again, housing was quite central to these protests as well. Now, what's important to remember is that in these particular forms of protests, and I was thinking about showing a video, however, we don't have enough time, but for those interested, the protests themselves were quite contentious and at times very violent in fighting against the apartheid regime. This can involve burning of tires, throwing of rocks, attacks on other residents within the township who they felt were betraying the movement. So there's a very long history of extremely contentious street protests, at times violent protests, as part of the anti-apartheid movement that made a number of claims on basic goods, and this includes in particular housing. So this is a quote from Nelson Mandela, the leader of the ANC, when he was released in 1990, that just speaks to this. So one of the first things he did when he was released from prison was to go around South Africa making these speeches, and this is one of the things that he said. The enemy is that of inadequate housing, forced removals. The Freedom Charter asserts that there should be houses, security, and comfort for all. We demand that the government provides these basic necessities of life. So again, citing the Freedom Charter, which is a document from the 50s that has no legal basis, and yet was quite central for understanding a right to housing during that period of time. So after 40 years, in the 1990s, the democratic transition taking place in 1994, by 1996, a constitutional right to housing was finally enshrined. However, this has been decades after you had already had mobilization around a right to housing that had no legal basis, and yet was still quite powerful in mobilizing South Africans during that period of time. So today, the right to housing, and this is based on many of the interviews that I was doing, was not just understood as a formal legal right, although there have been legal challenges around housing, but also a popular historical conception based on the struggles that were experienced during this period of time that I talked about, like the 1980s, for instance. So during my research, I spent time in Durban, spent interviewing a group and working with a group called Abahali based Abunjolo that does mobilization of shack dwellers, or what are called shack dwellers, people living within informal settlements. This is one example of one in Durban on the right. And this particular day, there had been a thunderstorm and a landslide. As you can see, they're living in very precarious conditions, and certain people had basically been buried alive, and they were attempting to dig people out when I came to visit during this time. So at that during that period, and while I was interviewing people and trying to understand what was going on, one of the things I was interested in is understanding why it is that these forms of mobilization actually took place, why housing was considered so central to these protests, among other issues. Although it might seem obvious from this picture, there's lots of issues going on in the township, and why housing was considered so important for these protests, and how the movement itself, Abahlali, actually got started. So in talking to the group, what I was told is that it all started as a community protest, in fact. Governments, as always in 1994, promised to give houses. Government, as always in 1994, promised to give houses in order to bring back the dignity of those people who were left out by the government during the times of apartheid. So what has happened since? Nothing. What you see here is a very similar type of discourse as the one mobilized within Egypt, in thinking about popular struggles and rights to basic goods as a justification for mobilization. And this is a group that's also engaged in fairly contentious street protests at times, but has also led some organized movements against boycotting elections, for instance, more recently in 2009. So when looking at the protests today, in both the form and content that you see in service delivery protests, there are a number of patterns that stretch back towards thinking about the rent boycotts of the 1980s. So disruptive protests and tactics, for instance, I talked about burning of tires, throwing of rocks, that were in many ways borrowed from the anti-apartheid movement. And some of the people that were involved in these protests today were also involved in rent boycotts in the 1980s. So I did research in a township called Alexandria where that was the case. Protesters use very specific dances, such as toi toi. If you're familiar with that, it's a performance that was actually inherited from the chaturanga in Zimbabwe. Also using struggle songs, which were very particular songs used under apartheid that symbolized the movement. So recreating these particular performances and thinking not just as the form of protest itself, but also the content and what are the claims that are being mobilized that are not so different from those that are being cited in the 1980s as being central to the anti-apartheid movement. So if we look at both of these cases in comparison, both Egyptians and South Africans were mobilizing around citizenship through similar claims to basic goods on the one hand. So in Egypt, bread and the claims around bread and basic necessities. In South Africa, housing and issues related to housing. But also on the other hand, the histories of mass revolt related to them. So not just that housing or bread was seen as a basic right or a popular right, but that there's the particular performances and legacies of mass revolt that are tied to claims to these goods. So claims to bread in Egypt and housing in South Africa may have a particular specific valence, one that you might think would be difficult to mimic in another context. Now, to some extent that's true. However, there are other cases. I said I have studied Nigeria, for instance, in fuel subsidies, where you have a similar type of politics being manifested today, though the history may not be quite the same. You don't necessarily have a charismatic populist leader like Nasser or one that epitomized the movement such as Nelson Mandela. But in a very similar sense, you have particular claims related to specific goods that get mobilized over time and thought of as popular rights. And when those come under threat, particularly periods of the 70s and 80s, during austerity and structural adjustment, they became solidified as popular rights. So that still exists today across the continent. So the content and democracy across the continent is actively being reinterpreted using what you might call pre-democratic histories and popular rights that are reshaping the continent's future. So this is what I've called in many ways democracy's preludes, and thinking about the kind of politics that are informing citizenship and claims to citizenship and democracy today in Africa. So I look forward to hearing your questions in the Q&A, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Marcus. That was wonderful. It's great to learn about your work and see the book project coming along. As I mentioned before, if you do have questions, feel free to either use the raise hand feature or you can type a question into the Q&A. If you do the raise hand feature, I can unmute you so you're able to verbally communicate your question. And I see that Tim joined us as well. So
thanks, Marcus. Let me start with a question, which is, so can you think about how what you've looked at in these two what people would see as very divergent cases could apply more broadly across the continent? Do you think that what are the lessons that you've learned from studying these that might help us understand protest in Kenya or Senegal or other places?
So for me, what is most interesting and probably the biggest implications, it's not necessarily that bread in Egypt has a specific significance or housing in South Africa. Okay, that's true, but I don't want to get pigeonholed into that argument because that's not necessarily what interested me in the first place. It was the fact that you saw very similar politics across contexts that otherwise you would think are very different. So how does this speak to other instances? As I said, I don't think that you have the exact same that's as clearly identified with these particular movements. But what I do think is important is an understanding what conceptions of democracy are getting mobilized in the 21st century, and seriously what that actually means. I think that we oftentimes assume that we know what democracy is supposed to mean. I think there's a whole literature on democratic erosion that assumes what democracy really is, which doesn't really thinks about inequality as seriously as it should. But if we want to really investigate what democracy is supposed to mean, we have to think beyond what I think is being rigid definitions of citizenship, which might be, formal rights and obligations, which are of course important. But from the observations that I've made in the cases I'm familiar with, there are also legacies and histories that are within, prior to any democratic transition, or in cases where you haven't had a democratic transition, that are still being mobilized and have a extended history and are informing the way that people think about democracy. So that goes back to like the survey, the Arab Barometer survey in 2011. What were Egyptians thinking about when they said democracy? Well, it varied, but one of the basic claims is around access to public goods and inequality. That's not necessarily what we might assume democracy means, yet it's quite critical if we want to tie together these rising forms of contentious politics where people are taken to the street outside of formal institutions and the kind of claims that are being mobilized. If we think it's only just about economic claims, we're going to miss largely the politics that's going on. So I think that it's critical that we reevaluate not just democracy, but especially democracy, but also the concepts that we associate with democracy, such as citizenship and rights, and what those actually mean.
Great. Anyone else have questions for Marcus? We said we would end at 1, so we got time for at least a couple of questions. So, Marcus, since you're new with us, one of the reasons we wanted to invite you was to sort of introduce you to people. Where's your research going now? Where are you? This is a project that you did earlier. What are you working on?
That's right. Yes. So I talked about earlier, there's different ways of interpreting or breaking down this democracy non-democracy divide. I think one of the ways that I'm interested in looking at this wave of protest is how experiences with democracy actually differ within the same state. So this is looking at what you might call subaltern traditions of democracy. South Africa would be a really good case, but also thinking more broadly in political science, how we've conceptualized democracy and why we might think of protest as being outside of that. So I'm currently teaching a class on democracy and protest. And one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize or work on, and the students are helping me as well work through this, is where protest fits within democracy. Obviously, there's rights to protest, rights to assembly. We think of political participation as being important, but where does democracy fit within our conception of the basic components of it? What does protest fit within our basic conception of the components of democracy, and the history of democracy, especially? So where I'm interested in going, I think what I'm looking to do with the book project is to try to reevaluate some of what you might call forefathers within comparative politics of thinking about democracy in the global South. In particular, I think Sam Huntington, whose work is really important. I know people think of Clash of Civilizations, but as you know, like Political Order and Changing Societies is central for how we think about democracy in the global South. Yep. And he's inherently against the idea of social mobilization. His whole project is to try to understand, on the one hand, the failure of democracy in the post-colonial world, and he immediately blames it on social mobilization and instead argues that we need strong institutions. Strong institutions are the foundation. And from there, you can have elite competition and later on some forms of participation. Where my interest is in going is in trying to reevaluate that. Who could we use, maybe we're not within the existing canon, but try to reshape that particular concept of democracy, which might incorporate protest within it, and how might that actually change our perception about the role of protest within democracy? So right now I'm looking at a comparison between Fanon and Huntington, largely because they're two thinkers that are actually around the exact same time in the 60s, trying to understand the failure of democracy in the post-colonial world, yet they come out with complete opposite examples. For Huntington, political order is what's necessary. Yep. For Fanon, political violence to an extent is necessary. Why do they come to completely different understandings as to what is needed for democracy? So this is where I'm starting with the project to try to reorient our understanding of protest and its relationship to democracy, but with a particular lens and focus on comparative politics, and how certain thinkers have really influenced our thought moving forward. Then using the cases from there to try to speak to this different dimension of thinking about protest or decolonization as being a central component of democracy itself and how that's been mobilized within these different cases. So that's the project as it currently stands.
Interesting.
The manuscript is far from finished.
It's making me think of the protest is usually written outside of civil society. We think of civil society as voting and lobbying and things like that, and all these other things sort of are not civil, and that's a very interesting area to move into.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Yeah. Any other questions? We're just about at our time. Well, why don't we wrap up there and say thank you to Marcus for letting us get to know a little more about your work. It's a very interesting